Welcome to the RSIS panel webinar on the Europeans in the Indo-Pacific, jointly on national and what does Asia think. My name is Sarah Teo. I'm an assistant professor and the coordinator of the Regional Security Architecture program at RSIS, and I am delighted to serve as the moderator for today's panel. So today we have 5 distinguished panelists who will spend the next 1.5 hours helping us to pass the approaches of European countries and the UK in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the responses from ASEAN and China. You should already have their detailed bios in the registration email, but please allow me to briefly introduce each of them. So first up is Dr. Frederick Kleim, who is a research fellow with the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS. Our second panelist is Ms. Alice Billen Gallant, a research fellow at Chatham House and one of the 14 NATO young leaders selected to advise the NATO 2030 process. Our third panelist is Dr. Elisa Heritage, who is a senior lecturer with the Defense and International Affairs Department, Faculty for the Study of Leadership, Security and Warfare at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Next, we have Mr. Gilang Kembara, who is with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Jakarta, Indonesia. And last but not least, we also have with us Professor Gao Jian, who is a senior researcher and the Secretary General of the Shanghai Academy of Global Governance and Area Studies at the Shanghai International Studies University. He also holds the position of Director of the Center of British Studies and the Center of Sino-Britain People-to-People Dialogue. And he is also the Director of the Center for European Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. So a very warm welcome to all the panelists. And thank you for taking time out to participate in this panel. So for today's session, I'm going to be conducting it as a moderated discussion. For those who are in the audience, please feel free to start submitting your questions already using the Q&A function. And hopefully, we will be able to address most, if not all, of your questions. So I want to start off the discussion by posing a question to each of the panelists, who will then have about 3 to 4 minutes for a quick response. So Fred, let's start with you. So Germany has published its policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, and they have also dispatched a frigate to this part of the world. So what do you think the focus of Germany's interest in the Indo-Pacific will be?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for having me. A warm welcome to everyone. I'm honored to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues of myself. Yeah, I mean, of course. So what it signals firstly is that Germany is sort of leaving its traditional approach, which has always been keep our head low, trade ourselves rich, and basically let the Americans do the rest, right? I'm exaggerating here, but that was pretty much our approach for the longest time. And it's, to some extent, it still is, but the guidelines that they have published, the Indo-Pacific guidelines and the deployment now of the warship, it's symbolically quite important and relevant. But I think we should not yet congratulate ourselves, right, for this deployment, nor for the guidelines. We should just see it as as a start, as a beginning of a conversation that we necessarily need to have in Germany. It is, when I travel back to Berlin, which I do quite frequently, it is remarkable how little debate there is actually about the Indo-Pacific, and also how little knowledge there is about this region, except for China, where German research is pretty good and there's a lot of information around. But it's a very good start to begin this conversation now. Look, the French, they have been deploying to this region forever, right? I mean, for them, it's quite normal. To my knowledge, they have sent like 5 or 6 or 7 ships even just this year alone, right? So, but for Germany, this is big. This is a significant change of our political foreign policy culture. I guess Germany's only just now beginning to see the military and the Navy in particular as an instrument of communication and strategic signaling, right? So it's very important to be mindful of the infancy of our foreign policy beyond the immediate neighborhood, right? And not least, AUKUS showed how quickly things can move and how easily events can kind of, I guess, overtake our capacity to manage them, and how easy it is to put Germany in like a very difficult position between our closest allies, right? Most of all, I guess it forces us to ponder the question we perhaps least like to ask, right? Which is where to position ourselves amidst new geopolitical fault lines, right? So I know I was supposed to give a very short answer, and if I was a diplomat, I would probably stop here now, but I'm not. So I will also add a bit of water to the wine, right? So the truth is here that, having said all that, I think I'm not breaking a massive secret here when I say Germany will not suddenly become some sort of hard power security actor here in this region overnight, right? So this for all sorts of reasons, for legal reasons, in particular because our military is a parliamentary armed forces, so we need parliamentary approval for any robust action, and this is very hard to come by, especially after the recent election, I guess, where parliament has changed quite a bit to the left. Our public is inherently anti-militaristic, pacifist, if you like. So it's quite a pacifist culture in Germany. It will be hard to overcome. For economic reasons, there is some change in perception among German businesses, but basically they still say, look, this is not our fight to fight. China is very important for us. I mean, the reason the German economy went through COVID relatively reasonably well is mostly a function of thriving demand from China, right? And then China, I dare say, last, is not our predominant security priority, right? It seems sometimes like it here in the region and within our bubble, it seems a bit like it, but it actually isn't for the vast majority of decision makers and elites, right? Our problems are much closer to home. Defense of NATO territory, of course, but even North Africa, Sahel region, the Middle East, all this is a bit more on our mind, right? So what our focus really should be, and then I leave it there, Sarah, is it should not be hard security. We should play to our strengths, really. It's important to send symbolic symbols, like frigate is a good symbol, and somebody recently said it's an entry-level requirement, right, to dispatch some sort of hard power, and I think that's probably true. But this is not the be-all and end-all, right? So we should really pursue a normative agenda, setting standards in trade, speaking out on human rights, and most of all, empowering multilateralism with ASEAN. So I think we need to really think in terms of order building here in this region. And for that, we need to have an inclusive dialogue, right? Multilateralism instead of exclusive minilateralism. This is really something we should leave to others. So just before I end it, I'm probably already a bit over the few minutes, but perhaps I can say that the guidelines and the EU strategy as well, right? I mean, let's not forget about the EU strategy. It's really about providing alternatives here for the region, right? Alternatives for trade, alternative for infrastructure development and financing, alternatives with strategic partnerships. So it's basically providing choices which decreases the dependency on the big powers. And from our perspective, it is diversifying Germany's partnership. Diversifying means diversifying away from China without forgetting China, but we have recognized an overdependence from which we're trying to diversify away from. Very happy to discuss in more detail each point, but I don't want to bore you all too long. So leave it to the next panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Red, for the very comprehensive assessment of Germany's approach towards the region. So I will come back to you on a few points later, but for now, I think I want to move on to Alice. So Alice, I think you have an excellent overview of the perspectives of both France and the UK on the Indo-Pacific. So in your view, what do you think are the main drivers behind their respective interests in the Indo-Pacific? And do they have kind of different or overlapping or complementary priorities?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I think I'm going to complement a lot of things that Fred has just said, because the main drivers behind British and French interests in the Indo-Pacific, and to a certain extent, wider European interests in the region, are, broadly speaking, the Indo-Pacific's growing economic, political, and strategic importance, which is, no big surprise to people in the audience today. And as you may know, the Indo-Pacific is currently the second largest destination for exports from the EU and home to about, I think, 4 of the EU's top 10 trading partners. So France and the UK, just like many EU members say, see the Indo-Pacific as an area of huge economic opportunity, and here think, trade agreement, but also connectivity strategies, but also an area of increasing tensions. And this is, obviously in growing part because of the US-China rivalry, which is usually encapsulated in European media by a focus on Taiwan and the South China Sea, but both in the French and British strategies, the interest and focus go way beyond. And in this instance, I think actually France and the UK are quite similar, because both are former colonial empires with full spectrum capabilities and historical ties to the region. Both are nuclear powers with a seat on the UN Security Council, and they actually see themselves as having a sort of extra responsibility vis-a-vis the region, and I think just the global world order, and really wanting to play a global role, including in the Indo-Pacific. And here there is, I think, the real fault line between Europeans when it comes to Indo-Pacific security, and actually despite AUKUS, and I know we'll cover that at length today, is not, to me, between the UK part of the Anglosphere on the one hand, and then continental Europe with the EU on the other hand. It's more with France and the UK on the one hand, and then the rest of Europe, including Germany, as Fred put it, on the other hand. Because when it comes to the security and defense issues, capability matters, power projection matter, and this is where I think you have a slight difference. But both Paris and London really know, and this goes to your question, Sarah, that the role they can play in the region is important, but it's limited. And a big challenge will be to make sure that this role is sustainable, that it's a persistent presence, that is providing alternative for the region, working multilaterally with also small and medium regional partners. And there are differences between the French and the British approaches. I know that Anissa will cover the UK more specifically. So I just maybe want to say a few words about the French strategy. The French strategy has taken a blow after AUKUS, which will impact France's key partnerships in the region, especially vis-a-vis Australia and the US. But I think it's really important to say that the essentials and the core French interest in the Indo-Pacific remain unchanged. And contrary to the UK, France is actually a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. It sees itself as an Indo-Pacific nation. It has territory, more than 1.5 million citizens in the region. And it was actually the first country to launch an Indo-Pacific strategy back in 2018, interestingly through the Ministry of the Armed Forces. And something that may come back in the discussion later is that France, maybe quite differently from the UK, is a bit more reserved in its association with the US policy towards the Indo-Pacific, as opposed to the UK, especially after AUKUS. And Paris's main objective are the pursuit of, French and EU economic interest, defense against coercion by systemic rivals and threats to French and EU assets and interests, but also maintaining the rules-based international order. And there are a lot of discussions about environmental considerations as well, including maritime sustainability, which is really important to France in the region. And just maybe one last point about the EU, which Fred has mentioned already, which is that as opposed to the UK, which you will all know has left the EU and doesn't have a structured dialogue on foreign security and defense cooperation with the EU, France has been really pushing for the EU to develop its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And Paris sees that as a vehicle to complement French national efforts, to multiply French power, but also to get Europeans to really think more strategically about the region, especially vis-a-vis the US and China, and to be just more interested and more engaged. And I think AUKUS has asked big questions about the role of Europe, of Europeans in the region, and these are still being answered today. And I guess this is something that we'll discuss further in the discussion. So I'll just stop here. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Alice. Before I move on, could I just quickly maybe follow up on AUKUS, since it is the new kind of in term that we use today. How do you think AUKUS might or might not change French strategy towards the Indo-Pacific?
So I think we have to differentiate a little bit AUKUS as an industrial contract, which has been, a big blow for France as also a defense industrial player, and then AUKUS as a matter of trust between allies, in which case Paris obviously sees the way things have been handled as very poorly, both from an Australian perspective and also from an American perspective, and we can discuss about Franco-British relation on the side. And this will have an impact, beyond the Indo-Pacific. And we're already seeing at NATO, which is discussing its next strategic concept, the French saying, well, what does that mean in terms of trust that we have with the United States, which, has kept us completely out of the loop, part of the world where we are a resident power and we have a role to play and we have been a reliable partner. So this issue of trust, I think, is really important. And the last one is more about what does it mean for France's strategy in the region? France had two key pillars in its Indo-Pacific strategy, which were India and Australia. The Australian pillar is a little bit shaky. It will take time for the dust to settle and for the relationships to be rebuilt. But again, the core interest of France's strategy in the region are unchanged. It remains, a power that has territory, population, that wants to play a big role. So it will be about reshaping the balance. And we have seen, French officials, for instance, talking more to Indian officials in the margin of the UN General Assembly. So I think this approach of multilateral partnerships and engagement will continue. But AUKUS has definitely been a big blow to trust, transatlantic and with partners, mostly Australia. So we'll need a bit of time for that to be digested.
Thanks, Alice. So we'll leave AUKUS there for the moment. And I want now to move on to Anissa. So perhaps, Anissa, you could help us to understand more specifically the UK defence community's perspective on British engagement in the region. So what is your assessment of the UK's objectives and interests in the Indo-Pacific?
Yep, thanks, Sarah. And I just need to clarify that my position, while I work for the Ministry of Defence in the UK, that I represent my own peer, and I do not speak to either the UK government or for the UK Defence. So, and all of the information that I use is actually open source. I echo what Alice and Fred have said around the strategy so far, which, as part of this global Britain vision that has come preeminently from leaving the European Union, that the focus has been pretty much on capacity building and developing relations in the region. So there are two themes that are going on, and I think this has come out so far. You've got you're dealing with the US-China and the strategic competition there, but we're also looking at how do we, the United Kingdom and European states, and as part of the EU as well, look at developing the multilateral side, the economic engagement, the capacity building in other ways. So until AUKUS, I would have said that was pretty much the perspective and approach that the UK was taking. There are three main documents that outline the UK defence position. The first is and these have all come out since September 2020. The first is the integrated operating concept. So that's a very military document, and it's the most significant shift that we've seen in UK military thought, for decades. And it's how you deal with warfare, the modern warfare, and how you deal with the competition and adversaries who are not operating within the context of the rules-based order. So what the UK is saying is that it understands that the strategic environment is now being defined by great power competition. So what we are likely to see are these blurred lines between war and peace, between public and private, foreign, domestic, state and non-state. And that really has been demonstrated by Russian and Chinese activities, primarily for the Chinese in the South China Sea. So it's about things to do with the cyber and the disinformation. So it's about a multi-domain integrative approach. So it's across 5 domains: the land, sea, air, cyber and space. So this is part of this concept. And it ties in with the integrated review around the idea that you use all your instruments of national power. So the mindset there is that you employ military as part of your national capabilities. That involves everything from industry, academia and civil society. So that was a very big step for the British military, and a lot of the work that's been done in the Indo-Pacific is actually is demonstrating and mirroring this, which I'll talk about later if we have time. Then we come on to the integrated review. So this was much anticipated. What we need to be clear here is that this is talking about a tilt, an Indo-Pacific tilt, not a rebalance. So the language was very nuanced and careful and considered. But what it does, it highlights the 3 pillars of UK foreign policy. So economics, security, defence, and the values. So it's, it really is, as has been said, it is a normative agenda as well around, defending the rules-based order, about multilateralism and inclusivity. So this idea of the UK as a force for good. And it's to be realised through the joining of the CPTPP, which is massive for the UK. Also gaining ASEAN dialogue status, again, a really big and significant step forward. We've got the relations with Japan, which are developing on all fronts and have been, they've been really carefully nurtured. We've got the Carrier Strike Group 21, which has been really big for the Royal Navy. And also the fact that we have the garrison at Brunei and the naval base in Singapore. We've got Five Eyes, and we've also got the Five Powers Defence arrangement. So these are all pillars of the UK Indo-Pacific tilt. And finally, UK defence, that came from the Defence Command paper that followed the integrated review, that is increasing military spending, but mainly in areas around electronic warfare, cyber, drones, prioritising the maritime. So we've got 7 permanent points of presence, so Bahrain, Oman, Kenya, Brunei, Singapore, Diego Garcia, and Qatar. There's also going to be the littoral response group that's going to be in the Indo-Pacific region from 2023. So that's in addition to the Carrier Strike Group 21. This is a way of maintaining a persistent presence. And so those, I would say, sort of like sum up the UK defence position. So I will stop there, and then we can talk about AUKUS and all those other exciting things that we can approach later in the discussion. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Anissa. Before I move on to Gilang and Professor Gao, I do want to kind of follow up with a quick question. And I mean, you mentioned the UK's presence in this region, and that it is ASEAN's newest dialogue partner and its engagement with several ASEAN member states. And I was wondering, given all that you, Alice, and Fred have said, what are the prospects for a E3 or an EU as a framework for cooperation, especially when engaging with platforms like the East Asia Summit or the ADMM+? Do you see it as, will there be a joint kind of approach, or will it mostly be nationally driven as the actors compete among themselves for engagement or even membership of these forums? Perhaps we could go with Anissa first. Okay,
how long have we got? I mean, the first thing that I would say is that there is no one single European approach. Even though the EU now has a strategy, it is clear, as Alice has said, that the French, France has its own, it's a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, has its own strategy. So I would say for now we're going to, beyond the EU guidelines which have been set out, and I think that the Dutch Indo-Pacific strategy makes it, makes it also very clear their influence in the EU strategy is saying that EU states need to play to their own strengths on this one. It is clear that not all states are, have a maritime capabilities or that full spectrum that France and the UK certainly has, and with Germany following up. I think it's also clear that from the Carrier Strike Group 21 that the Dutch Navy was involved with one of their destroyers in that. However, the German Navy did its own thing with, I think it's the Bayern, I think it was the frigate that they sent out. The French, as we know, also have their own engagement in the Navy. In the naval perspective as well. So the fact that the Carrier Strike Group was not a European-wide effort is quite important there. As Alice has mentioned, there's no formal UK-EU agreement in defence and security policy, but the UK ought to continue, cooperating with its major allies, its European counterparts, and so something like the E3, I would have said before AUKUS, would have been a good staging post for that. Now, bearing in mind that whatever France and Germany does will always, the EU will always come first. We have NATO, obviously, which is the key defence relationship, and we've also got the Joint Expeditionary Force, and the UK is working with France very closely in Mali. Finding a positive out of this situation, that the UK continues to share values and threat perceptions with its European neighbours, both within Europe and increasingly in the Indo-Pacific. So there are opportunities that certainly that could be that could come out of the situation with the UK leaving the EU. So But I would say for now that the United Kingdom position is that it wants to forge its own path. And I think that, you know, it will come back to working with European partners. But I think for now that the sense that I have is that the UK wants to, you know, forge its own path in the Indo-Pacific. It wants to work with Indo-Pacific partners, and, you know, all in one of those, but not the only thing. So I think in terms of the E3, it is not dead. And I think that we will continue to see certain things that will come from that in the Indo-Pacific, potentially, but not right now. And as we discussed, the French, you know, France is very, very upset over the situation with AUKUS, and that both from a trust perspective, it has been let down considerably by three of its, you know, its key relationships. So I don't say, as I said, I don't think it's dead, but I think it's probably a bit on ice for the moment. Plus the fact you've got the changes in Germany happening, so we'll need to see what comes out of the new government there too.
Thanks very much, Anissa. Alice or Fred, would you guys like to add anything else to what Anissa has said?
Maybe just to comment on that. I mean, I agree with Anissa's analysis. I think, you know, there will not be one unitary European approach or position, but a mix, sort of a patchwork of supranational approaches, maybe by the EU. NATO is also thinking about its engagement with Indo-Pacific partners, but also national strategies and more flexible groupings. What I think is important is for us to keep in mind is that the forms of engagement and the ways Europeans will go about it really depends on the policy area, right? Trade is one thing, security is another, defense is another. So I think we really need to be careful about what we're talking about. If we're talking about security and defense, then I think, you know, it's clear that, as Fred said it in his introductory remarks, the EU needs to play to its strength, and the EU's strength are more when it comes to, you know, connectivity, infrastructure, trade, lots of different types of dialogue, but not necessarily hard security and hard defense, which is something that the EU is struggling to do even on its own continent. And I think this is something that, you know, Europeans really have in mind, that the EU strategy and approach is not a security-oriented one, that there are positive things that the EU can and is aiming to do in the security realm. And here, we know, we can talk about maritime security, cyber, environmental, counterterrorism. But when it comes to really sort of hard security and the type of deployment that we've been seeing, both from the Carrier Strike Group and from French assets as well, the Bayern frigate, this is likely to remain a sort of national endeavor for the moment, or to be coordinated among Europeans. And I think with the US and regional partners such as Japan, Australia, etc., but not necessarily something that will happen in a supranational framework, be it the EU or NATO, which is not considering that type of deployment at all. So just wanted to maybe add that.
Thanks, Alice. I see that Anissa has a hand and Fred has a hand up as well. So if you could just give your comments very quickly, and then I want to move on to Gilang and Professor Gao.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah. If I just can quickly add something before we hand over to a local view. I guess for most people here in the region will probably tell you, especially when it comes to hard security, do it nationally, right? The EU doesn't get much done, so do it nationally. The thing is, though, in Germany, see, if history has taught us one thing, then never alone. Never do anything alone in the long run, right? Especially in terms of security policy, and I think this is very much in our foreign policy culture in Germany. So I think, especially when it comes to military deployments, okay, the frigate is now sailing solo, as it were, but I think we should embed it in a European approach. Now, if the E3 is the right framework for that, that remains to be seen, right? And I concur with what my co-panelists have said, right? That AUKUS may have done some damage to it. How long lasting that is, we don't know, right? We'll see. But perhaps we can sort of cooperate with the French there on that side. What I think where our real strength is, though, is really on the softer side, and this is where we should really amplify and complement an EU approach, and we should really see German foreign policy embedded as within EU foreign policy, and there we should really go to empowering multilateralism, right? Multilateralism is really struggling here in this region, at the hand, perhaps dying a slow death at the hand of minilaterals, right? So we should really be careful here not not to do too much damage to the multilateral structures that exist. And I think this is really where we can add some real value here. And then just one thing before I leave it here, which is quite important, and nobody has mentioned it yet, but it was in your question, Sarah. You mentioned ADMM Plus and EAS, right? This is something that is going to be very, very difficult, right? So I would expect the United Kingdom to be part of these forums relatively soon. For the European Union, however, that's going to be quite difficult, right? So maybe we can later go into a bit more detail of this. But the question here is really, I mean, who gets a seat, right? Does France get a seat? Okay, yeah, I mean, they would have a legitimate call to make for a seat at ADMM Plus and East Asia Summit, but how do you get the European Union then in, right? And who would sit there, right? The High Representative would be the logical solution, I guess, but he cannot really speak for French strategic priorities here in this region, or for German strategic priorities here in this region. But you can also not give a seat to everyone, right? Because then you have an EU voice max amplified by 3, right? So there are really some structural issues here with these forums that, and I've not yet heard a solution for that. So maybe later our ASEAN colleague can perhaps say comment on that. But it'd be really interesting to see how they would spin this national versus EU seat here. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Anissa, would you like to add anything else?
I just wanted to mention how, if anything, the relationship between the EU and the US might also be affected by AUKUS. I understand that France is pushing its concept of a strategic autonomy as well, more vociferously now than it has, this idea of the strategic autonomy from certainly from the US so that would be another area in which you might see the UK shift away from the EU approach to the region and more generally. And I think we'll see that. I think what AUKUS has sort of like said, which I was quite surprised that I have to say, that the UK is now beginning to align more with the US around China, whereas European states and certainly the EU has been very careful not to approach China from that more hard power, obviously, with the obvious limitations there from a hard power perspective. So as we've been saying, that there is no one single European approach. So I hope that the Southeast Asia, I mean, obviously we're talking about Southeast Asia, and it's a similar thing that that will happen from the European perspective. Southeast Asia, it's all the same, right? And I think it's both ways, that we've got very different approaches, and that builds a very complex picture there in the approaches to the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anissa. So Gilang, I think I guess you represent the ASEAN voice in this panel. So I would like to ask you, given that all that has been said and what we're seeing today, how do you think ASEAN should or would approach the interest and engagement of the UK and the European countries in the region? In the sense that, do you see that ASEAN or the ASEAN member states are keen to proactively engage the UK and the European countries, and in what ways can they actually do that?
Okay, well, hi Sarah, and I'd like to thank RSIS for inviting me, for putting me in the same panel as our esteemed colleagues here. I'm very happy to do it. To answer your question, first of all, I'd like to use a political lens here, and I think politically speaking, ASEAN member states generally do have positive reception to this increasing European attention to Indo-Pacific, for as long as ASEAN is mentioned, within in the center of it all. And this has been seen by various engagements that we've seen, whether it's defense, political, also economic. And when it comes to what sort of entry point or the similarities that could be mix and match between European strategies and that of ASEAN, it would need to be seen through the ASEAN outlook for Indo-Pacific, where looking at the context that this Indo-Pacific would play out in the future, ASEAN seeks to find, certain grounds where we can work together, cooperate together, and best of all, the ASEAN does not seek to push aside any certain actors, but they want to cooperate with everyone. And that's what the EU is also trying to mix together with the current seating with ASEAN, right? It's working together. It's not pushing aside. So we don't. When people think that ASEAN is taking the US, for example, the US viewpoint on Indo-Pacific, it's somewhat wrong in a way, because we don't necessarily seek conflict or seek any animosity with partners within the region. And that's why, politically speaking, it's positive reception. However, when it comes to community or socially within the ASEAN people itself, there seems to be somewhat of indifferent when we talked about Europeans having a greater attention into the area, in a way, because number one, we know that this area is so far away, and European powers or any powers that are very, very far from us have come and go in not just years, but decades and centuries ago. So it's always a question of, okay, it's good that they're here, but is it something that would be here for a long time? Is it a sustainable policy? With what sort of benefits it would come to me? Because when we hear about this engagement in politically wise, it's always talking about defense and security. And in Indonesia's case, we're very happy that Prabowo is very happy. Our defense minister is very happy to go visit European countries and talk about defense agreements. But for the people inside, what does that translate to them? Does that mean, when it comes to connectivity, most ASEAN nations can now go towards the EU without extra hurdles or extra barriers? Would no visa be needed or required in the future? So it really doesn't really translate a lot into layman's terms when it comes to all these benefits on the connectivity side. And when we look just maybe a short bit on the economic side as well, so far, if I'm not mistaken, EU has only concluded about 2 free trade agreements, SIPA agreements with 2 ASEAN member states, and still going on with the other several other ASEAN member states. And that sort of begs the question on how long are we? What sort of the hurdles are we looking at? How are we going to find a common ground to see this economic benefits to be translated for our businesses and also for our people here and our the markets in both sides. So it's somewhat different when we look at how it benefits to the people on the ground. So I'll leave it at there, Sarah.
Thanks, Gilang. So before I move on to our final panelist, Professor Gao, I do want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A function, and then I will read them out. So Professor Gao, could I ask what your assessment of the UK or European countries' contributions to regional stability could be? So in what ways could the UK and the European countries actually contribute to stability in this part of the world? I think you're muted. Yeah.
Is that okay now? Is that okay now?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, I would like to say I'm not on the position to judge on whether UK or EU has made a contribution to the area or not. It is the Asian people's voice that should be heard. And I think Gilang, the Indonesia expert, his comment is very instructive. And before I talk about some issues here, I would like to say again and again I heard about Asian Pacific, but actually in China, in Indo-Pacific, but in China, when we talk about this area, habitually we would use Asian Pacific, or specifically we would use some areas or countries that is highly relevant to Asian as a conception. But Indo-Pacific is highlighted as far as I remember in the Trump period. as a very strong strategic target against China to some degree. And but anyway, what I'm going to mention here is I don't think ASEAN's countries could benefit from that term Indo-Pacific, because strategically it will lessen the importance of ASEANs in the arena of the Pacific area. I would like to say first term, it is an open area in China's perspective, because we never, in Chinese government, never pursue any hegemonical, manipulating power in this area. Although definitely economically, both ASEAN countries and China, our economic relationship has been escalated by a large degree in the past several years. So talking about this area, what I'm going to be very interested in discussion is in what way the European countries are going to step into. Well, if we definitely economically at the both interest of our economic pursuit, I think we would have a very promising future, because economically our European countries still have some advantages to make full use of, especially in terms of some very important manufacturing industries to make a contribution to the ASEAN areas. And also China don't take it as a kind of, harm against the interest of China, because we in our philosophy, we think that once the economic circle is expanded and enlarged, and all the contributors or participants would benefit from that. Well, second point I'm going to talk about is actually China's active role in the ASEAN areas, in the Asian Pacific area, is primarily in our philosophy is economy. I mean, if you look at the past 5 years, actually, our bilateral relationship has been very much enhanced in terms of the economic cooperation, not to mention RCEP. And nowadays, if you refer to, you can find President Xi has made a promise. He said China is going to join CPTPP at a level which is unprecedented, open-minded. So in talking about China and the ASEAN, what I'm going to be very happy to discuss is in what way we are going to enhance our economic cooperation, in what way we are going to build up a platform that will benefit us economically. And that is something I personally think all the countries in this area would be very much interested in. Never talk about AUKUS. This is very military, far, far beyond me. Okay, but frankly, AUKUS, or as far as I know, AUKUS is a very heated discussion subject. However, it is not an impending big challenge or threat to the area, because actually it would take a lot of time. But I agree, AUKUS set up a very bad example. It's a very, very bad harbinger of the future's involvement in this area. I don't think personally this is good news for the area, for the countries in this area, because we want to enjoy peace. We want to enjoy prosperity. We don't want to be involved into or dragged into any kind of set trap in the name of the protection of something which is absolutely notorious. Last point, I agree again and again. I heard that the term multilateralism is repeated, and I agree with that, because the Chinese government would have much in common in talking about multilateralism in the principle of cooperation, participation, mutual benefits, and mutual respect to each other. However, in this very, very impendingly important time, may I suggestion any form of multilateralism should not be exclusive, should be inclusive, should be genuine cooperative, or that kind of multilateralism would be invalid would be powerless, would be of no significance and consequence at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Gao. So if we could just stay on you for a moment. So you mentioned that China's active role in the Asia-Pacific and in ASEAN is primarily in terms of the economy, which actually sounds very similar to, I think, what Fred and Alice and Anissa have said about what the EU or European countries also want to do in this region. So from your view, do you think there are any kind of mutual areas or shared interests that both China and the Europe side can work on together in terms of enhancing, economic integration or cooperation in this region?
I agree. I personally take a very promising attitude to this respect, because I think, judging by the tradition of the European countries, all the lessons we have learned from the last century, I think the European countries, particularly talking about Britain, talking about Germany and France, we do have much in cooperation in the future, because we fully realize the importance of peace and realize actually, something we should have a deep respect for that. I absolutely understand in terms about the political ideology. There's some insurmountable gap between China and Europe. However, I think both sides would have the interest and enthusiasm to boost our cooperation in this area, because we absolutely know Asian Pacific area is a magnet, is a power provider for the future economy. And I think the Chinese government would be welcome the European participants in this area. However, I see there's a growing difference in terms of the world strategy between, we say, European continental countries and Anglo-Saxon countries. This gap is enlarged in the past few years. Personally, as a scholar, I really, really cannot understand why Australia would take some steps in their foreign policy making. Because in my opinion, in my philosophy, this is absolutely unreasonable, because I cannot see what they can gain from their policy making. And this is quite interesting anyway. But I don't think that Australia would be a real threat for this. For China, I don't think it is a real threat, because we know what to deal with it. But I think Australia's policy would bring a lot of harm to the area, because, talking about Indonesia interest, talking about Malaysia interest, I think Australia's behavior and performance is actually excluding itself from the area in the future, which will do a lot of harm to itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gao. Okay, so I would like to go back, I think, to Anissa, Fred, and Alice to respond to some of the comments that both Gilang and Professor Gao have made. But before that, I do want to ask Gilang, actually, because there's been some talk, right, about minilateralism, about more exclusive groupings emerging in the region. So, Gilang, do you think that these are developments that ASEAN should be concerned about?
Sorry, wrong button to press. Right, thanks for the question. And in some ways, I do have the certain worries, because in the past, we've seen that when ASEAN tries to be in the driver's seat with these many major actors in one room, it doesn't really put a lot of, I wouldn't say benefit, but at least the benefit has been, well, look what we have right now: increasing tension, security dilemma, possibility of an arms race, though there's no arms race. So is it, the question now begs, is it worth pursuing the current system that we've had for the past years and decades? Because if I can make the analogy now, when ASEAN tries to be in the driver's seat with these countries bickering between one another, it's like you have, when you're driving and you have your children screaming behind you, can you concentrate down the road? I can't do that. I mean, I have one child, and when he screams at me, I can't concentrate on the road, right? So it's almost impossible. So why can't we try to create somewhat a different personal sort of engagement between ASEAN and our dialogue partners with some groupings, not necessarily unilateral, but more of a personalized engagement, so that we understand what concerns are, what that sort of dialogue partners or what these partners can offer on the table that have the same sort of mutual interests between one another. Because when we can strike those mutual interests between parties, that's where the trust grows, and that's how, you know, the trusting relationships between these actors can start to be built. But when you have the countries all bickering between one another, engaging in a screaming contest, and by the end of the day just say, all right, we're just going to send a submarine with ballistic missiles in it, then there is nothing, no soluble, no practical solution to be offered. So that, for me, there needs to be a different sort of mechanism or ways to engage ASEAN's dialogue partner, unless ASEAN would be rendered moot and would be just pushed aside on the sideline by these newly emerging minilateral groupings that seem to be trending right now.
Thanks very much, Gilang. Fred, can I invite you to respond or make your comment?
Yeah, hi, Sarah. I'm keenly taking notes here from Prof. Gao and from Gilang. Good stuff in there. And I agree with some of what they say, but I must also, I think we need to all remind ourselves what we're talking here. What we're talking here about, right? Asia Pacific was all about economic integration. It was about sharing the prosperity of the tiger economies and of the rise of Asia, and sharing it a bit more broadly, setting rules for trade and so forth, right? Indo-Pacific is to some extent, and I agree with Prof. Gao there, is to some extent the unraveling of this, right? Indo-Pacific is really about a strategic redefinition of what this region means, right? And that China is not happy with the Indo-Pacific definition is of course very obvious, because their influence gets diluted if you just double the geographic space, right? If you bring India into the fold in the Indian Ocean, the Indian subcontinent and so forth, you automatically dilute the massive dominance of China, right? So it's, I guess what Roy Metcalf once said, it's all about mental maps, right? But from mental maps also strategy sort of develops. And I'm looking at my notes here from Gilang and that I took from Gilang and Prof. Gao. And I think what we need to remind ourselves here that China is to some extent, and I'm pretty sure Prof. Gao will not agree with me on this one, that China is to some extent its own worst enemy, right? I mean, China has really assembled a coalition of forces against itself better than the United States ever could have done, right? So China, by some of its perhaps inconsiderate action, it has redefined how countries here in the region perceive of their own security, or rather of their own insecurity, right? So that Australia turns to such things as AUKUS, like minilateral engagements, or the Quad, right? We haven't even mentioned the Quad, but the Quad was kind of like the first big security minilateral that developed here, right? It's kind of it's natural, right? Okay, I mean, I don't want to praise myself here too much, but I do a bit, because like over 2 years ago, I already wrote that all this is going to happen, because you don't need to be a genius. All you need to do is you need to read Steve Wall's balance of threat theory, right, from the late 80s, and you can predict all these kind of developments immediately, right? So this is okay. This is understandable. What we need to ask here, and this brings us back to the topic of our webinar here, is where does Europe fit into this, right? And from my perspective, I think Europe does not fit into this hard power definition of balance. A hard power balancing of Chinese let's call it overreach, right? Where it infringes on other countries' security perceptions is necessary. But this is not something the European Union or the Europeans, perhaps the UK is slightly different. This is not something the Europeans can do. This is something we leave to Americans, and we leave it to the regional powers, because we need regional legitimacy, of course, most of all. And Indo-Pacific is not just an American concept, right? Let's be honest here. The Japanese have kind of spoken about it. So has ASEAN and so forth, right? So it does have some regional legitimacy. And again, hard balancing is necessary. I mean, if Scarborough Shoal incident has taught us anything, we really need to be on our toes here, and we need to be able to militarily balance Chinese overreach. But this cannot be the be all and end all, right? Henry Kissinger reminds us that hard balancing very, very easily, a military definition of a balance of power very, very easily fades into conflict, right? Before you know it, you're at a war nobody actually wanted. Miscalculation, I don't need to tell you all this kind of stuff, right? This is, eventually it will shade into war. So what we need to think about here, and I said it, I think, in my first statement, we need to think in terms of order building. And this is really where European Union can come in, and where the Germans can come in, and the French, of course, too. We need to have some sort of, I guess, some sort of softer check on this hard balance, right? We need to make sure that this hard balancing effort by minilaterals does not automatically translate into some sort of bloc formation of non-cooperative blocs that kind of like forget to talk to each other and only think in terms of conflict and military definition of the Indo-Pacific, right? What we need to do is we really need to invest in multilateralism here. I repeat it again, and this is not some nonsense I write in an op-ed. This is something I really believe in. If we let minilaterals, security minilaterals, take over the region, we will end up in war. I guarantee you this. What we need to do is we need to invest in multilateralism. And here I go back to Prof. Gao, because Prof. Gao mentioned the word inclusivity, and then I will leave it and to the other ones. But let me just finish this thought quickly. He mentioned inclusivity, and what is the main difference between minilaterals and multilaterals? The main difference is that minilaterals are exclusive and targeted, and multilateralism is supposed to be inclusive. And this is really what we need to invest in, because if we do not have dialogue, with China, but have some sort of a great power dialogue, I guess, if we just have some sort of bloc formation, we will end up in a situation which nobody of us wanted, right? So instead of thinking only about hard security, Europe and the European Union should really try to invest in multilateralism. And the minilateralism really harms ASEAN, right? We have seen this minilateralism developing. Many people will say, you read it left, right, and center, many people will say minilateralism is really a response to the inefficacy of ASEAN. ASEAN being a talk shop, multilateralism being no longer capable of dealing with the challenges that are happening here in the region, and therefore we develop minilaterals that decide to kind of complement it. Okay, but then stay true to your cause, right? If you have the Quad, for example, branching out into all sorts of different things, right, doing vaccine diplomacy and all that kind of stuff, which I'm really surprised how it has been applauded here in this region, that they are branching out in all these kind of areas. No, stay true to your original purpose, okay? Concentrate on hard balancing and leave the other stuff to ASEAN, because what you're actually doing is you are marginalizing ASEAN, right? The fading and the slow death of ASEAN centrality becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if one continues to marginalize ASEAN and open other avenues, right, beyond ASEAN. Okay, I leave it there. Sorry for this slightly emotional statement.
Thanks, Fred. I'll give Anissa or Alice a chance to respond as well. Shall we start with Anissa? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, thank you, Professor Gao. I mean, highlighting the complexity here of managing these sort of like these mutual interests that we have, and the inclusive, particularly in the economic side, and that sort of like it comes up against these more exclusive minilateral security interests. I mean, from the UK perspective, I have to reiterate that this is a tilt and not a rebalance. European security will always be the UK's priority, you know, by the nature of the fact that we are a European state. We may no longer be in the European Union, but we are certainly a European state, you know, and France will always be our neighbours. Those are facts. And there are also limitations, as we've mentioned, in terms of the security side, of a European presence, which is why I agree with Fred that until AUKUS, you know, this idea of focusing on the inclusive nature of the economics, so the UK joining TPP, you know, that leads on to supporting the regional multilateral organizations, you know, defending the rules that support that trade are really, really important. And, you know, I may say controversially that I think that perhaps AUKUS has been overplayed somewhat, and certainly, you know, this idea of this being, you know, all about the Anglo-Saxon nations coming together. If you look at it, you know, the pragmatism of it is that the UK is very closely aligned with the US and also has a very long-standing relationship with Australia. So in many ways, you know, you could say that these days it's not a new security alignment, it's just been made into something bigger that's just pulling together this existing web of security and this relations. And, you know, for the UK as well, this, you know, AUKUS perhaps, you know, this is something that it can say is part of this global Britain strategy and in its evidence of this, of the Indo-Pacific tilt. So, I mean, you know, Alice might have something to add to this, but it could be, you know, this idea of the UK is grabbing hold of the, you know, the coattails on this one, you know, on the bandwagon perhaps of what is primarily an Australian and US agreement, which is, I know the French foreign minister has described the UK as being the fifth wheel in terms of this relationship. So I am surprised that the UK then has put itself very firmly in the US camp here, and I think this is something that until this point we've been keen to avoid. So I do echo what Fred says there, and the fact that the E3 would then be something that would maybe balance and pull together this inclusive approach to the region that is needed, and it also supports the approach that ASEAN wants to be taken as well to the region. So that's very important there, that we listen to our Indo-Pacific partners. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Anissa. And Alice?
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, I don't want it to be too long and repeat what colleagues have said. I think Gilang's point about what regional partners actually want and need is really, really crucial. And I think this is something that Europeans are trying to really keep in mind in terms of their engagement with the region, and also in terms of balancing sort of defense and the symbolic of, you know, sending an aircraft carrier in the region with sort of actual need of countries in the region, and the more sort of long-term partnerships that are in the interest of both sides. So I think this is really something that is at the forefront, especially of the EU's thinking, because again, I mean, the vast majority of EU member states have neither the military capabilities or the will to be militarily engaged in the Indo-Pacific, because for a lot of them, they don't even have the military capabilities to help much about their own security and defense or that of their immediate neighborhood. So for the vast majority of European countries, and again, you know, we've been talking mostly about France and the UK, which in a way are quite the odd ones compared to the vast majority of EU member states, which again don't have that ambition or want to work with the region in non-defense and security terms, mostly about, you know, rules-based order, trade, economics, etc. My second point is more about the sort of different ways the Europeans have been engaging, and you know, I agree with Anissa that AUKUS is, you know, a slight let's say reinforcement of the British position, going in one direction with maybe the EU and the rest of Europeans in the other, trying to maintain, you know, not a third way between the US and China, but being really clear that they don't want to have to pick a camp and have to choose really clearly. To what extent this is a very sustainable position is a question. And I think this is the type of big question that will be confronted in the years to come, which brings me to my last point, which, you know, we haven't really discussed, but which is not so much about sort of European involvement in the Indo-Pacific, but also when, in a way, Indo-Pacific, and here mostly China, comes to European security. And this is when I've seen in the Q&A a question about, you know, different definitions of security. And I think this is where Europeans are also being sort of forced into taking a tougher line, not on, you know, military deployment in the Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea, but when it comes to disinformation, cybersecurity, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, investment screening, etc. These are the type of things that make Europeans, you know, be more proactive and think that they need to act jointly vis-a-vis what they perceive as you know, a systemic challenge coming from China in particular. And here, just to mention one area, you know, that is, I think, quite of interest to Europeans, but increasingly so, is, for instance, you know, when we talk about China coming to Europe and the European neighborhood, is, for instance, you know, China in the Arctic, which is not something that we talk about much, but when the EU is thinking about its own neighborhood, it's also thinking about how other partners fit into this. And I think it does need to be seen as a two-way street. And something that happened, I think, earlier this week was a joint EU-Japan naval exercise. And that wasn't done in, around the South or East China Sea, but that was done in the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea. So I think there are also interesting partnerships and thinking to be done, not just about Europeans in the region, but also vice versa, and what the dynamics are, and to what extent this balance is going to be maybe shifting a little bit over the coming years.
Thanks, Alice. So we have a question now
Can I make the response?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just to respond to Frederick, I don't think that China dislike the term Indo-Pacific because of the involvement of India. Frankly, I don't think India is a challenge against China to some degree, because India is far, far away from that. And China never pursued the dominance in this area. So talking about lessen the dominance, because our philosophy, expand of the mutual and bilateral interest is the target we pursue. Well, as talking about the threat, this is a very impendingly uncomfortable word. Threat, what is a threat? Have a look at the history. What is the threat? This is a word that is a very good reflection of the history of the last century. And ASEAN areas, countries are very well. I don't think the memory is far away, because colonization is the shared experience China and the ASEAN countries had suffered in the last century. China is a big power. I agree with that. Is a growingly big power, and probably in no more than 10 years, we would very likely be the largest economy in the world. And but I don't think the logic here is like China is growingly powerful means China would pursue the dominance. China would be more and more influential in this area, but China would not pursue the dominance and hegemony, which is absolutely against the Chinese philosophy. We're talking about hard balance. I agree with Frederick. And personally, I never believe in hard balance. This is an international theory derived from the Western philosophy. Philosophically, this is Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, talking about how to make the balance in the name of social contract, because we are evils by nature. Therefore, we have to stick to the contract, because if you hurt the other people, that means you would be very likely to be hurt. But I think the Chinese philosophy always talk about the real security that we could enjoy is absolutely from our spiritual world. Means we should understand that never are believing the hard balance. What we should believe in, I agree with you, like soft balance. Like we really, really mean the balance is very important. The peace should be enjoyed. The prosperity should be shared. That is the philosophy we should stick to in the Asian countries. And I think we have the larger possibility for that. For the global Britain and for about Britain, allow me to be a little bit straightforward. I don't think E3 is a very good suggestion. In my opinion, it is more like a fallacy, because if you look at the past 4 years in terms of the relationship between EU and the UK, you would see that this is a disaster. And I personally, I focus on UK for a long time. I cannot understand, although emotionally I could understand sentimentally, but I really cannot understand the contemporary UK policy towards EU. Because you talk about the global Britain, how could you realize global Britain if you fail to maintain and sustain the bilateral relationship with your close neighbors, economically, politically, or militarily? This is something far, far beyond my understanding. We're talking about EU-China cooperation in this Asian-Pacific area. I think we do have a lot of things to do. I suggest we could have another conference for that. And because, even talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese government think highly of the importance of the participation of EU. And we do respect EU's role in the standardization, EU's experience and philosophy in a lot of areas. And I personally quite understand the tradition of EU is different from China. And the EU has a lot of personal understanding about Chinese policy. You have personal view and concerns about your interest. Talking about G5, talking about security of data, talking about labor like protection, talking about property. I quite understand that. And I think, that the Chinese government keep a very open minded to that. That is why IT 2 years ago or last year, however, which was suspended by the Congress. So I think there's a promising future for European and China cooperation in this area. But let me remind you one thing that is very important. Never forget about our American friend. What I mean is that, may I remind you, if you look at the situation in America nowadays, Trumpism. Do you think Trumpism will rise or not in the future in America? So EU must think about what kind of strategy they should keep on in the future in such a tremendously changing world. This is very, very important. Personally, I think Americans' foreign policy is more and more unstable in the future. That is something I remind you to give sufficient attention to. Okay, thank you. Stop here.
Thank you, Professor Gao. So before we go to the question in the Q&A, I do want to give Yilang a chance to respond as well. So you can respond to any points in the previous panelists' comments. Or you could also, my own question is how do you see, do you see any areas where ASEAN, the EU, and of course China could work together within, say, the framework of the BRI?
All right, thank you. I like to frame it all, especially under Fred's point as well, in the context of multilateralism, in the context of ASEAN, and how are we going to engage ASEAN further? Sarah, you asked about what the mechanisms are with China and the BRI. What Fred talked about with how we should stay on course and not let unilateralism put us away from where are we going, is truly something that I do believe as well, wholeheartedly. And listening to a lot of people, saying whether ASEAN is relevant or not, should we just abandon ASEAN, should we just take it down apart or something, that really is quite disheartening. But I do understand their frustration, because when we try to deal with one thing, it's like trying to open 1001 door before we find out the solution. We really have to jump through the hoops and all that. And the thing with ASEAN is that you really need to engage with every single layer of policymakers and stakeholders in every area, whether it's defense, security, politics, energy, women's rights, children's rights, whatever. All of these aspects, you really need to ensure that everyone is on board, unless you want to make some political fuss about it. And so this sort of layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy really just slows down ASEAN a lot. And with political dynamics such as the Myanmar crisis that we are handling, this is just another fire that we really could not afford to handle at that moment. But still, it is our obligation. It is what we have to do, and it's happening in our front yard. So that's why I was trying to at least find some ways to reform this sort of mechanism, this layers of bureaucracy that slows down everything, and that puts ASEAN, at the mercy, but at least they need external help at most areas. And as such, that's why we really have to find, that interest, that mutual interest that are currently on board with ASEAN, its member states, and the external partners. And regarding with China, especially with the BRI, it's certainly something that most of us here in ASEAN, we have some critical discussion about it. We do also have that critical perspective. But at the end of the day, it's actually one of the projects that's quite at least benefiting in terms of economic, although there are still certain questions on how it would benefit the social fabrics and the communities. Here in Indonesia, we also conducted survey in regards with how it benefits communities, villages, and everything, on how it has affected them. And because of the fact that most of these projects are still somewhat under construction, or at least at the very beginning of their inception or development, the effects is still very, the positive effect towards the people is still very limited. It needs time. I think there should be, time should be given for the BRI to somewhat show itself on how it could be beneficial to ASEAN and its member states. And then once we have that, we can see that whether it's actually a good thing or a bad thing. But for me, there is still, a lot of areas that certainly that could be taken into consideration, definitely. But at least it provides some alternative. It provides area for competition for our economic players into ASEAN. And we certainly find the benefits that it provided towards, to the countries, not only politically speaking, but to an extent also socially speaking. I think I'll leave it at there, Sarah. Thanks.
Thanks, Gilang. Okay, so I will take the first question in the Q&A box. And that's really for you, Fred, I think. And the question is, isn't economic power, increasingly also seen in the security space as well? So what does that then say for Europe's contributions?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. I'm not quite sure I understand that question right. Is it seen in the security space? So maybe what the question is referring to is really that economic power is being used for security ends much rather than just mutual prosperity or so. And that's certainly true. Economic power is being weaponized, but that has always been the case, right? And from all sides. China is obviously very good at this. Let's be honest here, right? Getting diplomatic influence and concessions in security areas via economic leverage. But China is not the only one. Everybody's doing it, right? Look at the European Union is weaponizing economic influence for sure, of which they have a lot. This is their main leverage, right? Look at how, for instance, I could name many examples. One here, close here to the region, would be EBA review, right? For instance, giving preferential trade benefits to certain countries here in the region and then removing them on human rights grounds is sort of using the vast EU market and the leverage that comes with it in order to achieve political ends, right? And I personally believe for the right reasons from a normative perspective, but this is definitely weaponizing the leverage of economic power. And I guess in order to curtail this is why free trade agreements are so important, no? This is why it is so important to trade on the basis of agreed upon rules. And let's bring it back to the topic of the webinar. This is really where the European Union is so strong, right? Setting standards for trade. But this is also where ASEAN comes in, right? Let us use RCEP as an example, right? So in the Western media, this is bizarrely, falsely being portrayed as a Chinese-led sort of way to dominate regional trade. Of course, as we all here, all the panelists know that's nonsense, right? RCEP is a genius ASEAN-led way to connect regional economies' prosperity and stability to China, to China's rise. And this provides some sort of, institutionalized stability here to the region by unifying ASEAN's +1 trade agreement into one big tent trade agreement. This is a small brick by brick approach of building regional order or rebuilding regional order, right? So a long answer, that would be a long answer. The short answer would be, it is definitely a force for security ends, but it can be a positive as well as a negative force. So again, I would say the European Union should really step in here. And hopefully, eventually, we will get our region-to-region free trade agreement, which we've been trying for so long. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Fingers crossed for the free trade agreement. So I'm going to take, I think, the second and given time constraints, this will be the last question I will take from the Q&A box. And the question is, could the panelists address nuclear deterrence as a factor for stability or instability in the region? China seems to build up her arsenal. Two of the European powers are nuclear powers. AUKUS includes sharing nuclear technology, and some have also called for Japan or even Taiwan to have or to share nuclear weapons. So is this a worrying or calming trend for potential tensions? Anissa, if I could go to you first for a response.
Oh, hit me with the challenging question. I'm not a nuclear specialist. I mean, what I can say is that the UK Navy, the Royal Navy, pursues a continual at-sea deterrent strategy, and we have done so since the end of the 1960s. So this is by the submarine and the use of Trident. The UK is updating its current Vanguard class with the new Dreadnought class, which will be, they're coming in, I think, from the late 2020s onwards. The thing about AUKUS and the deal there is, I'm not sure exactly what this means for Australia in terms of having the nuclear, having a nuclear, the submarines or however that is. I mean, I'm not, to be honest with you, because if the UK is in the process of building its new submarines, does that mean that we will be giving some of the Vanguard class to the Australians? So I mean, I'm assuming that this is a thing that's really more between the US and Australia as to how that's going to work in terms of how this nuclear capacity will be deployed by the Australians. So I'm really speaking from very limited information here. Now, in terms of whether it will add or detract from the regional, and this is my personal view, and this has nothing to do with the UK government's approach, because obviously the UK government views deterrence as the last nuclear power, the nuclear subs as the last form of deterrence in the region. Again, I'm not 100% sure as to what exactly we're going to be sharing with the Australians here. So whether or not it adds to, I'm sidelining this question a little bit, whether it adds to the regional security, it's going to be kicked into the long grass. I mean, this is not something that's going to be happening very quickly. So my answer is I'm not 100% sure, but I will pass that over to Professor Gao, because I'm sure that he, in terms of the region, might have something more to add to that from the China perspective.
Thanks, Anissa. Professor Gao, you have the floor.
Before I touch on the very troublesome topic about the nuclear power, I'd like to share with a very good piece of news. That is, in the past 3 seasons, the bilateral trade amount between China and the ASEANs has grown up to by 20% compared with last year. So that means economically, we are more and more strengtheningly integrated with each other. That is something I want to share. I'm very glad to see that. Talking about a nuclear power, what I'm thinking about is, my observation always asks me a question. If China had no nuclear power, I think probably China would be again and again invaded by some powers in the world. Think about it. Have a look at the history in the last century. Have a look at what we have learned from the last century's history. The reason China wants to possess nuclear power historically is because we are very much threatened by the previous Soviet Union and America. The American government did have the plan to bomb China with nuclear power in 1960s. So that is why we want to invent and develop our nuclear power system. And I fully understand the participant mentioned the question here. Something I would like to enlarge, that is, I think all the Asians people, ASEANs, China, Japanese, Korean, all the participants, I think including Australia, all the participants in this area would never see war to happen in this area. We want to enjoy peace and prosperity. We are a very industrious group of people, and we have the possibility to enjoy a leading power in the world's economy. Why we want trouble? Why we want war intervention? Why we want someone who always talk about the conflicts, talk about the trashy, or like a difference of mentality, which is very much hypocritic. I think the Chinese government, if you look at the practice of the Chinese culture and history, the Chinese people are always a pessimism country. And to be very frank, history tells us if we are weaker, we would be invaded and very much threatened by some powers. So talking about peace must show the genuine demonstration of, that kind of honesty, trust to be enjoyed by the other side. I agree, frankly, I agree. This world is more and more lacking mutual trust. Why? One reason is China is growingly important, powerful. I agree with that. But the other reason is what? I remain it in blanket. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Gao, for that very frank and sobering comment on China's perspective. So we are running out of time. So I will, pose a final question to all the panelists, and you guys will have about 30 seconds to a minute to kind of just wrap up your thoughts on the topic. And the question is, following from what Prof. Gao said about a lack of trust in the region. So what is the one thing that you think the region should do to prevent this perhaps inevitable slide into conflict, right, in the context of Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific? So maybe we start with Fred.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, can I quickly, before I answer that question, can I quickly also come in on the nuclear question, just very, very briefly, because I don't want us to mix up things here, right? AUKUS has no immediate non-proliferation problems, right? Because what we're talking here about is not nuclear armed submarines, right? We're talking about nuclear propelled submarines in the first place, right? We're not really talking about nuclear weapons being now positioned in Australia, on Australian soil or something, right? So having said that, as we know, this AUKUS deal will only come to pass. I mean, eventually Australia will get its nuclear submarines, I guess, but we're talking here 10, 15 years from now, right? So what is going to happen is, you heard it here first, in the meantime, is that the Americans and perhaps the British even will station some nuclear propelled submarines in Australia. And what you will see, and I think this is important to understand about AUKUS, it's not really just about the submarine deal, right? What this is laying the strategic ground for a force reallocation, especially by the United States to Australia. So I think what we're going to see in the next few years is, under the banner of AUKUS, what we will see substantial increase of US capabilities in Australia. And eventually, I wouldn't completely rule out that this will have non-proliferation implications in the future. And Southeast Asia, of course, as we know, will not be happy about this. But there is no immediate non-proliferation implications here from what we know now. So what I've just said is speculation, right? But from my strategic experience with strategic questions, I think this is relatively likely to become an issue in the next 10 years or so. So sorry for delving into this, but I just wanted to clear this up. And also on your question, what is the one thing we should do, really? I think I've already said it, right? It's about empowering ASEAN. It's about empowering multilateralism. This is really what we can do. Hard balancing is necessary, but the rough edges of hard balancing really need to be sort of smoothened, right? And this is where we need to empower multilateralism. And I of course, agree that ASEAN is, let's say, a troubled vehicle, right? But wherever ASEAN falls short, we still have options of functional cooperation, right? Like functional cooperation on the Mekong, stuff like that, where countries can get together on a unilateral basis and deal with specific topic where ASEAN perhaps falls short. But ASEAN should always be the first point of call, and only once it fails, we should explore different options. Empowering multilateralism. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. We'll go to Anissa next.
Yes, I just want to say thank you to Fred for clarifying that position on the sub, because that's a very important point to make. I think from the UK perspective, it was very clear that joining ASEAN as a dialogue partner and the CPTPP were the areas there that were very important for its Indo-Pacific tilt. So like Fred, I will say that ASEAN is the key. It is the key, certainly to the UK strategy within Southeast Asia, and that includes the developing the multilateralism, remaining really on task around things to do with inclusion. And so while it's building these security strategies, city relations around that, maintaining the focus on ASEAN is going to be crucial. And the other thing that I would like to say is that for all of the European strategies, you know, the French was the first in 2018. That's relatively recent, and the UK and the EU, you know, was only this year, and the UK, was it in March of this year? I can't remember. Anyway, it seems like a long time ago. So these are developing strategies. This is not the end point. What we're going to see, you know, is these strategies developing over the course of the next few days. And I also agree that UK-EU relations and rebuilding those relations is also going to be a really fundamental issue, not just for European security, but also for the approach to the Indo-Pacific as well. That might be one that's slightly down the line from the where we are at the moment. But we've been through a divorce, you know, so you can't expect relations to be, you know, really friendly after something that, you know, really big that has happened both to the UK and to the EU. So that's my comment, and I shall stop there. So thank you.
Thanks, Anissa. Alice.
Thank you, Sarah. We're running out of time, so I'll be very brief. I think, I mean, Europe is also, you know, struggling a little bit with getting results out of multilateral fora and thinking collectively with how to engage with the Indo-Pacific. I think something that, you know, ASEAN has been doing in countries in the region as well is to, you know, try and think about how to use European engagement and what type of European engagement they want, and also how that fits with, in a way, the US engagement and US-led security arrangement in the region, because I think this is also where Europeans are thinking, you know, to what extent are we coming up with a European approach, or is it a transatlantic approach? How do the two things fit together? And I think it'd be good to, you know, think a little bit about, you know, what Indo-Pacific nations and you know, organizations such as ASEAN want to do with Europeans. How do they want to use European engagement, and how they see that fitting in with engagement from the US, whether it's a separate thing or seen together. And Europeans themselves disagree a little bit on that. So I think it could be good to also reshape the discussion a little bit around that.
Thanks, Alice. Prof. Gao.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, personally, I never understand why a country would be interested in the pursuit of hegemony. In my philosophy, I cannot understand why. My understanding about the world, about nature, tells me anyone who are interested in the pursuit of philosophy would be deeply self-hurt in the future. Have a look at the history, have a look at America nowadays, we would understand. Any country in pursuit of philosophy, in pursuit of hegemony, would be seriously responded. So let me make a call, if there is possibility for that. All the nations, all the Asian countries in this area, let's do two things. One thing, any country who are in pursuit of hegemony, let's make our joint efforts to crush it down, to pull it down. And the second suggestion is, any country who want to make trouble in this area, let's drive it out, because there will be no interest for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Kao. Gilang, you have the last word.
Sure. Perhaps I thought that, in the 2 years since the pandemic, when the world has lost more than, I suppose, 5 million people, I would have assumed that conflict should have been put on pause. But then again, what we saw here seems to be that I'm quite a naive enthusiast in that department. But then again, I think just one word, I think we should sort of focus more on the supremacy of law at this stage, in a way that no one should think that they're above it. No country should be given sort of special precedent when it comes to it, and everyone should be underneath it, and it should be realize that they are bound to a certain extent, perhaps some errors in their way. Indonesia, for some sort, we also have found our errors in various of our ways, but we try to rectify all of that. So when we sober up ourselves, we see where we at and what we could possibly go in the future, under the direction or under the law that we've concocted in the past. I think that there's one way that we can try to strive to avoid any conflicts in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Gilang. Well, that leads me to close the session. This has been a great discussion. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all 5 panelists for sharing their views and insights with us. And of course, thank you to the audience as well as for being with us over the past 1.5 hours. All this could not have happened without the RSIS events team, so a big thank you goes to them as well. So with that, I'm happy to bring this session to a close. I hope you guys have found it interesting and useful, and we hope to see you at the next RSIS event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.